Do you want the perfect system that is simple enough and open enough that will let you create any character, any story that you could ever dream of within this system? And you want it to be easy enough that it's not super hard. Well, you came to the right place, as in today's episode of the RPG Goblin, we are going to be talking about Fate Accelerated, which is a generic system, which basically means you can pretty much put any story and characters into this game and play it and make it work because this is a generic system, which means basically it's completely open to whatever ideas that you have. It's not built for fantasy or sci-fi or anything like that. The character creation itself is open and easy so that you can literally create any character that can do pretty much anything. Today, I bring on Parker and Brandon from Nat One Nerds, who is a fellow TTRPG podcast where they explore and delve deep into different systems and play them out. I totally recommend you checking them out. Their podcast name, along with their social media, will be in the description of this episode. But yeah, let's get started and talk about Fate. Today on the RPG Goblin, we are going to be talking about Fate Accelerated, which is a very interesting system from what I understand about it and from reading. It's basically kind of a quote-unquote quick start version of the Fate system, but it has its own rules and there are differences within the system itself, but that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I brought on two guests, technically, today, Nat One Nerds. And if you guys would like to introduce yourselves.
Hello, this is Brandon.
And I'm Parker.
And we're here from Nat One Nerds, and we also do some RPG explorations, and we thought it'd be fun to hop on with the RPG Goblin and talk about Fate since we just finished up our exploration of it.
Yes. Yeah, and that's a big reason why I wanted to bring you guys on to talk about it, especially since you more recently played through the system itself. I always think it's, better if the people are more familiar within the system, have played it a few times, all of that. And the more recent, the better, of course. So I'm very curious. I know we talked about this a little bit on your guys' episode, which I recommend anyone listening to this. I went on Nat One Nerds myself, and we talked about exploring TTRPGs. And through that, we talked a little bit about Brandon and Parker's experience with getting into Fate Accelerated, but I thought we should cover it on here as well. How did you guys get introduced and learn about the system for the first time?
So I was the one that suggested to Brandon that, hey, we should look at Fate Accelerated next after exploring Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition.
I had never heard of it before he mentioned it.
It was actually the system that got me to start branching out from D&D. I was introduced to it through a podcast called Improv Tabletop, where they were primarily a Fate Accelerated podcast where they went on these little mini adventures, and they were just so outlandish, so fun, so creative. I was like, wow, this is an amazing system. How come I never heard about this? I was like, is there other systems like this out there? And it got my mind turning, and then that's when I approached Brandon in the first place. I was like, hey, why don't we explore TTRPGs together and do it through a podcast format? And so when we finished Dungeons & Dragons, Fate Accelerated was the system that I was next most familiar with. And in exploring it for myself and playing it for myself, I was absolutely not disappointed in it.
Yeah, and as for me, I was, like I said, introduced to it through Parker. When he brought up the idea of doing the podcast, he was like, hey, let's start out with Fate and, after we finish D&D, because we're both D&D natives, so we didn't really need to study into that at all. But he was like, yeah, let's try out Fate. So I was like, okay, sounds interesting. I've never played anything outside of D&D, so I'm willing to give it a shot. So I did some research and was a little confused at first. It took me a while to really figure it out, but once we figured it out, we were able to have a lot of fun with it. So basically, I was introduced to it through Parker, ironically.
Yeah, and that works out great. And I think, other people introducing friends into TTRPGs is always a fantastic experience in itself. But Yeah, so I mean, you just talked about Fate with the improv. What's the name of the podcast again? Sorry.
Improv tabletop.
Improv Tabletop, with it being a Fate Accelerated dedicated podcast. And you mentioning that there's like a lot of goofy kind of adventures and stuff. That brings me to my next thought. Fate as a system is what I would consider a generic system, where it gives you the tools to pretty much create any sort of game you want with any sort of characters within the game, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Because I feel like with Dungeons and Dragons, you get this amazing sandbox to play in, but with
Mhm.
Fate Accelerated and similar systems, they kind of give you the tools to make your own sandbox to begin with.
Yeah, Dungeons and Dragons is very much the stereotypical high fantasy medieval feel, and they branch out from that a little bit. But that's kind of like their core. Fate,
Mhm.
there is no core. It's literally whatever the heck you want to do with this system, you go do it. If you want to be superheroes set in the future, you want to be aliens, you want to be knights fighting dragons, you want to be a mailman and an accountant, whatever you want to do, it works.
Absolutely. And that's what honestly I find so intriguing about Fate and Fate Accelerated itself, both of the games. Because it really is any possibility within the game. You can do anything you want, and it's the possibilities are endless. And I for Fate Accelerated and the Fate game itself, the character creation is a little different because of this aspect. Because you can't really have, I mean, you could have stats, but that still narrows you down within, you know, what kind of genres you can go into, things like that. There's not set classes, anything like that. So I would love if you guys would like to run through the character creation process of Fate Accelerated, because I think that's such a huge aspect of the game.
Oh, absolutely. So, when you're making a character in Fate, most important thing is to talk with your game master beforehand and figure out exactly what you're doing, what kind of setting, and what
Mhm.
kind of characters would be appropriate for that. Because, like we said, it's really open, so it won't really make sense if you, say, make a medieval knight when you're doing a campaign that's set in the future fighting aliens, unless, of course, you find somebody to fix that in, that'd be totally cool too.
Yeah.
But a lot of times the game master themselves will want to set restraints of like, okay, here's what we're going for. And once you have a general feel, you'll want to create a character and pick out what they look like, give them a name, some identifying features. And instead of having really stats like you do in a lot of TTRPGs, you have what's called aspects and approaches.
Yes.
Yeah, because the whole point of Fate Accelerated is that it's very focused on the role playing aspect. Where if you compare a character sheet from Fate Accelerated to one of D&D, D&D's got the heavy combative aspects, how hard you can hit, how fast you can hit, what
All
kind
the
of
numbers,
damage.
all the abilities.
Oh yeah, like everything is focused around combat. While with Fate Accelerated, it's all about the role playing, and that's how the just like the whole system in itself. That's how the character sheet is made. And one of those aspects is actually called aspects,
Mhm.
where you start off with what's called a high concept, where it's a descriptive aspect of your character that really defines.
It's like the key feature of your character.
Yeah, it's
Mhm.
the key feature of your character, and this aspect is something that you can invoke in the game to help you overcome different um, obstacles and challenges and stuff like that. So instead of just, oh, I'm just gonna fight my way through this or something like that, you essentially use these different aspects. So they have the high concept aspect, and then which defines your character, as Brandon was saying, and then you have a trouble aspect, which gets your character into trouble.
Basically, it's like
Mhm.
their reverse defining feature. Like, what defines them in a negative way? Is
Yeah, negative
any good
trait to
character
make
is gonna
things more
have bad
interesting.
aspects. Yeah. hmm
Yeah.
Yeah, and you can invoke these aspects using what's called fate points. and everybody starts off with 3 fate points. Now, there's ways to get fate points in the game and all that kind of stuff, but to kind of keep it on the simpler end, you start with 3 fate points, and especially if you're just going to do like a 1-2 shot type thing, then 3 is plenty.
Yeah, it's kind of similar to inspiration. Your DM gives you a certain amount you start out with, and then the GM can help you get more, or you lose some. It just depends on how they feel like playing throughout the game.
Yeah,
absolutely. And so, very quick, you would then, in comparing to more of like a D&D TTRPG term, is these aspects are sort of like your abilities. However, they are tied in with like personality and more narrative focused aspects of the character as well.
You could say they're kind of similar to like your class features, but without having a class.
Yeah. Okay. Very fun. Very fun. Yeah, and I always already like the more narrative focused games themselves, and just with Fate, where your main kind of quote unquote abilities that you get, the aspects are tied in with your character and how your character acts and things that your character, things that they're good at, but also negative traits. I really enjoy that.
Yeah. Oh yeah, like for example, there was a game we played where my character actually was an accountant, and his high aspect was that he was extremely skilled with numbers. So I could say use a fate point to invoke that aspect whenever there's anything number related to get huge advantages on making sure that I could get it right. But on the downside, my character's problem was he was super OCD and a pain in the butt about the numbers. So if anything was ever wrong, it would drive him nuts, and he could not move forward until he was sure that it was right.
Oh, that's super fun. And then that just opens up so many opportunities for role play centric events happening, and that's super cool. I love that so much. Can I just say, I love negative traits within characters, whether it be ability scores or stats or just negative personality traits. I just think it's always so compelling to play a character that has those, so I just get happy about it.
Yeah, and what's really cool is that the booklet for the Fate Accelerated system, when it talks about your concepts or other aspects, because you can have more than 2 or 3 aspects. We played with just 2 aspects and what's called a stunt, which is kind of similar-ish to an aspect, to kind of keep it simple, since we were only doing like kind of a one-shot short adventure. But in the booklet, it actually will talk about the high concept, and it will encourage you to think of something that can be used as both a negative and a positive. So it isn't always 100% a positive for the player. It's still another thing or another aspect that the GM can invoke on their end to enhance the story even further.
Yeah, and I like that it can be used both ways, as a player or as a GM. And so that also just enhances the narrative aspects of the game itself. So cool. You mentioned stunts as well. What are stunts?
So, as I was kind of saying, stunts are kind of similar to aspects. So, for instance, my character was a psychic detective that legitimately believed he was psychic.
Mhm.
And one of his stunts was what's called broken clock. And this is something that our GM actually helped me flesh out a little bit more. And essentially what it was is that once per session, my character is able to know exactly where to go and when to do so. So even though, because he believes he's psychic, when he's actually not psychic, he's just that observant and is kind of that good at what he normally does.
And it comes from
And
the
the
phrase
Sean
broken
Spencer's.
clock is right twice a day.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, very true. Oh, I like that a lot.
Yeah, that's kind of where we came up with like the title for the stunt, because I was like, I kind of want to do this, and he's like, well, why don't we call it Broken Clock? And I was like, that's perfect. So it just really helped, just without even writing a description of the character, just reading the aspects and the stunts of the characters in Fate Accelerated, you get a really good idea of what kind of person they honestly are. And so I would I'd use a fate point to invoke one of my stunts. And I did it at one point, and I was like, hey, I'm going to use my stunt right now. I feel like this is a moment where he might get this right. And so I ended up rolling pretty decently, and we were able to get to where we needed to go.
Mm-hmm. Or like, for
So
example, my accountant character, his stunt was called Cook the Books because he was so good with numbers. Basically, if we ever got really unlucky or like had something that was highly probability related, he could invoke that stunt to affect the probability in our favor and make it more likely to succeed.
Oh, that's so fun. And again, the amazing thing about these generic open systems is the fact that you can make these stunts and aspects be whatever you want. You can make these abilities be anything. They don't, at least as far as I know, they don't have any like predetermined ones within the book. It is completely up to you to create and make the perfect ideas and abilities for these characters. It's so cool.
Oh yeah, it's so nice to be able to just build whoever you want. And they have a couple of suggestions in the book to kind of help you like understand how it works. But yeah, it's just totally open. You're not pigeonholed into any sort of builds or classes or anything. You just make the character that you want, build them how you want, as long as it's cleared with your table and your GM, go for it.
Because when we did our little one-shot adventure, I was a psychic detective, he was an accountant, and then the other person was a mailman. And
Just some guys.
that was the party.
That was the real A team right there.
I know.
So good. I love it so much.
So, as Brandon was saying, you can literally be whatever you want. Fey Accelerate is just there to provide the tools so that you can not only be who you want, but you can kind of do whatever you want in the sandbox that you created because you created it.
Exactly.
Absolutely. It creates the skeleton for you to build upon the story of. It doesn't matter what you add onto the body, let's say, but as long as the skeleton is there, you have the framework, you have what needs to be there in place, then you can build whatever you want in it and, create the sandbox, do what you want.
Exactly.
And I think Fate works so well as a collaborative character and world creation game as well. Like, have everyone be together, bringing their own input and their own ideas within the idea for the world, for the game that you want to play, for the different not decisions, for the different events that you want to happen within the game, for the character creation itself, because other people, like you said, with your GM giving you the input on the broken clock as a stunt, other people can also bring their own input in on your character and help you create them to be such an interesting and fleshed out character just with the collaborative nature of that. And another thing, very quick before we move on, I saw something before that talked about Fate, and it said Fate focuses on who the characters are versus what they can do, which has like just stuck with me so much because I think that's the best description of Fate that I've ever heard. It is about who the characters are and the characters, not their abilities, like a Dungeons and Dragons game where it's so ability focused.
Yeah. And there is one more part of the character creation in Fate, and that's called the approaches. That's kind of similar to the stats in other games, and that kind of describes a little bit of how your character operates. So there are 6 approaches, and they are careful, clever, flashy, forceful, quick, and sneaky. And that basically just describes how good your character is in that aspect. Like, how quick are they? How sneaky? How flashy? How clever? And how character creation in Fate Accelerated works is out of those 6 stats, you give one of them a +3, 2 of them +2, 2 of them +1, and the last one would be a neutral +0. And that's like the standard array of how good the average character will be at everything. And you kind of allocate those depending on your character's personality and what they kind of do.
Mm-hmm.
And when you do use these approaches, when the GM calls for these approaches to be made, it's really up to the player to narratively explain what approach they're going to use and why they're using that approach. And more often than not, the GM will allow it because it's allowing the player to have that creativity and that authorship within the story being made at the table to be able to do that. So
Yeah, and it's the narrative first system, you know? Narrative first, describe what you're doing, worry about roles and the more mechanical details later, which again, I love.
Yeah, it's like, for example, if your party comes up to, say, a locked door, you could say you try to break down the door, so the DM would have you roll, see how forceful you are. Or if you try to pick the lock, maybe they'd have you roll for sneaky. Or if you're going to look for the key, they'd have you roll clever. There's all sorts of different creative ways, and it keeps you from getting pigeonholed from just make a dex check.
yeah, I feel
Mhm.
like in Dungeons and Dragons, the DM will call for something specific more often than not, while in Fate Accelerated, it's the reverse, where the player more often than not will narratively explain why they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah, and then the GM reactively will say, okay, use this stat. And it's kind of similar to checks in other TTRPGs where the GM will discreetly set like a threshold of how high you need to roll to overcome the
Mhm.
obstacle, depending on the difficulty. And then you add your modifier from that stat, and then that's how you see if you succeed or not.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that actually is a good lead into. So, Fate has some really funky dice. Called
Yep.
called fudge dice, and these dice essentially have blank faces, plus sign faces, and minus sign faces, and those are what you roll when you are rolling for one of these checks, for one of these actions. Whatever you're rolling for, you are rolling those dice. Would you like to explain exactly how that works within the game? Because I think it's so fun.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like a lot of good TTRPGs have dice in them, right? We got to have our, shiny math
Oh,
rocks or
of
the equivalent
course.
of it, you know. Um, but yeah, as you were kind of saying, so the fudge dice, or as Fate likes to call them, fate dice, either
Mhm.
one works. You have two blank faces, two negative faces, and two positive faces, or two pluses.
Yeah, so six-sided dice.
Yeah, they're six-sided dice. And each player and even the GM will have, in Fate Accelerated, will have four of each. And
Mhm.
when you try and approach, um, you will roll those. And just kind of like in Dungeons and Dragons, you'll add whatever approach is most appropriate narratively, and that'll be a result. But if you're more in an encounter scenario, or what we like to say in D&D is a combat scenario, you start to get more options when it comes to
Mhm.
modifying that dice roll. Because
Absolutely.
the way it kind of works in Fate Accelerated is that you have um, four different basic actions you can take on your turn. You have a defend action, which more often than not is not on your turn. You're reacting to somebody doing something to you, and you're having the chance to defend yourself as your character.
Mhm.
Um, you can create an advantage, which I feel like both our characters did most of the time in our one encounter. We both were
Yep.
trying to create advantages for the whole party to try to create those advantages and then exploit those advantages um,
Absolutely.
and whatnot. Because um, and then you can obviously just straight up attack. You know, I mean, punching somebody is pretty straightforward in in any narrative RPG. Um,
I mean, that's one fun part about Fate is because you're not using like class systems or weapons or anything. It's just as effective to punch someone as it is to like maybe lash out at them with a your mom joke or whatever the heck you want. Like
Or shove
emotional
them into
damage is
a
a real thing.
yeah, and Fate Accelerated, because in our one encounter that we did, we were able to whittle down the enemy mostly through non-physical violence.
You can have a totally
Mhm.
pacifist game if you want.
Yeah, you can. We used logic in our rolls against the enemy, and that caused him to have more stress. We appeal to their emotional side, which caused more stress for them. And when you build up enough stress, you get taken out. You're essentially quote unquote defeated. And so it leans heavily into that narrative aspect of the game. But kind of back
Absolutely. And
to
doesn't make you get stuck in the just repeatedly attacking every single time it's your turn. Like, oh, it's my turn. Okay, I'll just attack 3 times with
Roll
my
to
sword.
attack. Okay, I missed. Move on.
Yeah.
so, but what's really great is that you can add these approaches to your aspect. So if you want to invoke a fate point toward an aspect or a stunt, whether permanent or a temporary aspect of it, you can then take that aspect, those numbers associated with it, and then add them to the roll on top of it. So, for instance, if you're in an encounter and you're fighting somebody, whether through words or fists, either way, you can, if you say, for instance, my character creates an advantage, I succeed on creating that advantage because I rolled higher than the enemy, and then Brandon's character decides that they want to exploit that advantage against the enemy, he can now add the associated number roll that the GM put into that aspect when it was created and add that to his roll along with the normal modifiers from the approaches, if that makes sense.
Yes, and I do want to clarify with the rolls. So you're rolling the 4 dice, and let's say you roll 2 pluses, a blank face, and a minus. You essentially just add those up to be the additional modifier you add on. So if it's 2 pluses, a minus, and a blank face, it's going to be a +1 because it's like +1, blank, it doesn't add anything, and then -1, and then it equals out to a +1 in the end. And then you add that on top of whatever modifier and thing that you are doing already, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Like, for example, if you're really unlucky, you could use your +3 approach and still get all 4 minuses and end up with a total score of -1, and that would suck.
Mm-hmm. Oh, no.
Yep. Because as you were kind of saying, that those negative aspects of the game aren't any less fun than the positive ones, because as you kind of said, it's all about the who of the character rather than simply what the character can do.
Yeah, I mean, even though, like, when you're playing these games, you want to play a really awesome character, but it's not about being a total badass all the time. It's about playing just these certain kinds of characters that you really want to play in a system that will allow you to play them. So if you want to just play an accountant, a mailman, and a fake psychic, you can do that. And they're just like people, you know? But they do have things that they can do, but that's not the focus of the game. It's just bonuses onto what you can do within the game.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Because I noticed when playing my fake psychic detective, I realized that during the encounter, I was like, not only did it make sense for my character to focus more on creating advantages using his quote unquote psychic abilities, aka his observation skills, to help his teammates out, but I had just as much fun doing that as I would have running up and punching them.
Oh, yeah.
Because they give you, it like makes it feel like you're actually doing something.
Yeah.
Like there's so many games that I feel D&D specifically can be so restrictive because it's got, you know, the action economy of this, and this. Action, bonus action, reaction, blah, blah, blah. You can only do so many things, and it feels like sometimes you're wasting an opportunity if you're grappling someone. You could be doing damage to just get this fight over with, but if you're grappling someone, that's going to create an advantage, but it just feels like a waste because, you know, it's all about dealing the damage and getting the high numbers and all of that. It's about ending the combat as quickly as possible.
That enemy.
Exactly.
And that's one of the things I really like about Fate is instead of using typical damage and hit points like a lot of TTRPGs they use what's called a stress system, where everyone has a set of stress points. And whenever you're dealt, quote unquote, a blow through someone rolling against you, you take a stress point instead of taking damage. And if you want to avoid stress points, you can take what's called consequences, which they range from, you can have a mild consequence, moderate, or severe. Mild consequence could be like you trip and hurt your ankle and you're a little slower for the rest of the encounter. Moderate could be like, say you end up getting injured and can't continue fighting. A severe one would be like maybe you broke your leg. And that helps you to mitigate your stress points, but it's kind of a give and take of how much are you willing to give in consequences for your character in exchange for that stress. And it's a cool, unique system. But on one of the parts I really like about it is this allows for you to have full-on encounters with just conversations with people. Like you can have a straight up scenario encounter with an enemy where it's just like a really intense debate, and it can be just as any combat in D&D because you're using those stress points. And D&D, other than persuasion checks, they have nothing for social encounters. This is amazing.
Yeah, they don't. They really don't. And that's, again, what I love so much about exploring these other systems is finding games that actually have social mechanics in them. It makes me so happy. Like, oh my God, it's actually more than just persuasion and straight charisma. It's something that builds upon it. And I feel like can even help new people who are getting into role-playing games get used to role-playing, because it gives you a bit more structure other than persuasion, charisma. That's just how, charismatic and how much of a personality you have. Because I feel like a lot of people also tie personality to charisma, even though that's not really how it works.
Well, it's interesting because, again, just to go back to it, in our encounter in the Fate Accelerated system, Brandon's character actually used one of his stunt to cook the books to actually then inflict logic upon the enemy, causing him stress points.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's so cool
because he played a very OCD, awkward accountant who would have had 0 on his charisma modifiers if he were a D&D character.
Oh yeah,
at best.
Or use my accounting knowledge to actually real quick fudge numbers in a book to be able to convince the enemy of some logic that may or may not have been a little off from the truth. But normally, with my horrible charisma as that character, I'd never have been able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
It's so crazy. It's so crazy how just reworking some elements and mechanics within the game just gives you so much freedom. Gives you so much freedom. And so that is also one thing. The whole stress mechanics and consequences kind of reminds me of a game called Blades in the Dark, where a big thing there is an actual harm / health mechanic for your characters, but a big part of your characters is stress, and you take stress through planning, through trying to protect yourself from harm, stuff like that. So like hearing it being talked about in Fate just makes me it just reminds me of Blades in the Dark. But that just, again, those elements are just so cool, and stress I think can be a much better indicator for a health, can be a better alternative for a health bar, in my opinion, because health in D&D, it isn't really health if you think about it. It's more so your kind of how long it takes for you to actually take a mortal wound. Does that make sense? Versus
it's like
stress,
a mixture of your will and physical capability of being able to continue.
Exactly. Like you're not actively getting super, super hurt the entire time. You're not, getting sliced and taking like mortal wounds the entire time, because you wouldn't be able to, take 75 health worth of that in a combat, because that would bring you down really, really fast. But with these games, it shows it in stress. Like you are stressed and you are getting worn out, and you are, starting to wear down, and that's when you then get your stress when you get to your stress capacity, that's why you then go out of the combat, or not the combat, but the encounter, versus you just kind of get knocked out, which is always a weird thing for me within D&D, is because I feel like you wouldn't just automatically get knocked out and unconscious. It's so weird, but I like how a lot of games handle their sort of hit point alternatives, because I just think they're so much narratively cooler, and the consequence is also really cool. Along with, I know there's other games that even use conditions, such as like being frightened or angered and stuff like that, to show you starting to get to your wit's end within an encounter. So freaking cool.
Yeah, and what I like about the stress thing is that obviously we play TTRPGs as a form of escapism from reality. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, in order to be relatable, a little bit of reality has to be there. And I feel like with Fate, not only does it allow just more options narratively speaking, but it also kind of relates to us, because as we learn, especially in recent years and in this age, it's clear that that our emotional well-being and that our mental well-being is just as powerful as our physical well-being. Just
Yep,
because we
absolutely.
physically can get up and go to work doesn't mean we mentally or emotionally can. We don't have the
Mhm.
willpower to do so.
As a psychology major, I endorse this message.
uh, absolutely. I just think it's such just I don't know, it does bring some human aspects to the game. It really does, because if you think of it in hit points, it is such a gamey term. You know, hit points, how much damage you can take versus your emotional and your mental state.
I mean, it also helps to keep people out of metagaming. Like, for example, if you're playing D&D, you look over and say, hey, how many hit points is this person at? That's just so abstract. Like, how do you quantify that as opposed to, like, how stressed does this person look? Do they look like they're ready to give in or ready to drop?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Well, plus every character has 3 stress
Yeah.
in Fate Accelerated. And you can, depending on how, because stress, you get stress as a character when, say, they roll to attack and I roll to defend. And once added all up, they have 2 pluses or 2 positives more than I do. That could actually cause 2 stress right off the bat.
Mm-hmm.
But I can either take the 2 stress, or my other option is to take a mild consequence, which is the substitute for 2 stress in Fate Accelerated. And that's where those consequences start coming in. And they're kind of fun to do because they not only allow you to stay in the encounter a little bit longer, but it also adds a lot more narrative tools within the encounter that everybody at the table can equally exploit, not just the game master.
Absolutely. And as well as instead of just getting knocked unconscious, how they handle you being out of the encounter is different as well. I want did any of you end up kind of going like needing to get out of the encounter because you hit your stress level?
I don't think
No, I don't
anybody-
think we did. We're actually pretty well coordinated and we did really good. And the DM might have also been going easy on us because it was our first time, but
Hmm.
But it didn't, whether he was or not, he did such a good job, and it didn't take away from the fun of it. And I definitely think that just how Fate Accelerated is allow that to naturally happen. Also, you mentioned Blades in the Dark earlier.
Mhm.
If I'm remembering correctly, the same production publishing company creates both.
Yes, Evil Hat
Evil
published
Hat.
both of them.
Yeah. That's probably why you're
I-
like, oh, it makes me think of Blades in the Dark. I'm like, oh, probably one of the aspects is that it's made by the same company. But
I mean, I think it's. I'm pretty sure it's different writers, though. They do. They kind of have aspects, like between a lot of the games that end up being a little similar. Because I think people that are a fan of usually their other games will come to Evil Hat, for like publishing and stuff like that. But Evil Hat, I mean, if no one knows what Evil Hat is, it's a publishing company. It makes some awesome games. Fate. There's an actual like there's a bigger version of Fate that I think is a little looser than Fate Accelerated. I think Fate Accelerated is a good way to get introduced into Fate. It kind of it gamifies things in a way that I think makes the transition from something like D&D to a pure narrative game a little bit easier.
it's the gateway.
It is, yeah, it's the gateway. If you go, Fate Accelerated is a great way to get into it. Then they actually have Fate, and they publish a bunch of other games: Blades in the Dark, Monster of the Week, Thirsty Sword Lesbians, all kinds of stuff. But yeah, they end up having kind of similar vibes throughout the games. I mean, most of their games are also not most, but a lot of their games are powered by the Apocalypse or Forged in the Dark, which work off of similar systems themselves as well. I shouldn't say similar systems. Forged in the Dark is definitely inspired by, powered by the Apocalypse. So it just kind of works that way. But yeah, I mean, already that comparison, just with it being the same publishing company, absolutely. But I actually have the Fate book itself, and I only more recently looked into Fate Accelerated when I was talking with you guys. I did get it before that point, but I never really looked at it and read through it. I mostly read through Fate, which, again, like I said, is a bit more advanced. And I wouldn't even say in a way that makes it super complicated. It just goes a bit more into that narrative play, even more freedom. I don't even think they have approaches in that game. There are just, I think you end up getting modifiers or something. I could be wrong, but I think there's just modifiers that you naturally get or that you figure out within playing the game itself. So it's a bit more complicated, but I think Fate Accelerated is such a great way to get introduced into that style of game before going into something like Fate, like the normal Fate.
Yeah, if I remember correctly from looking into Fate Core, the way they work with the approaches is kind of the way you play your character helps to determine your approaches. And say
Yes.
you're constantly doing very flashy stuff, then you'll gain points for flashy, and you kind of build it up over time instead of
I
just
believe so.
the same array.
Yes. And which is its own like really cool narrative, approach to a game, makes things really interesting. The aspects and stunts, I believe, also go over to that game. Makes it super fun. It just can be very intimidating as someone who is just starting to get into other TTRPGs, seeing, not like as much structure as you're used to and just kind of panicking like, what am I supposed to do? I just never have seen anything like this before. Fate Accelerated, great way to get something a little bit more comfortable to then transition into something more narrative if you want to, because Fate Accelerated, I think, is such a fantastic system within itself. You could play so many games with it and be completely fine.
Oh, absolutely. I feel like this Fate Accelerated is such a great system for just very short adventures or even one-shot adventures. It's the booklet you can pull out. I mean, if you think about it, this booklet is 44 pages long. You grab a set of fudge dice for everybody, and you're rearing to go. Like, it doesn't take long at all. Like, with the D&D session, it takes a little bit more prep work on everybody's part.
Oh gosh, you got to read the Dungeon Master's Guide, the Player's Handbook. Like, there's so many books.
Oh, you assume I've read those books.
If you want to know the system in depth, with Fate, it's a pamphlet.
Is this a bad time?
Absolutely.
I've never really read the Dungeon Master's Guide this whole time.
Oh, I mean, I've been
so
DMing
much.
for over a year and I haven't.
I
just find those books to be very overwhelming to read. There's just a lot there that also deals with lore, and it's like, okay, I'm just gonna create my own lore and my own homebrew stuff because I don't care too much about the I don't care too much about the official D&D lore to like stay to the books about it.
Oh, see, I'm one of those nerds where when I get bored, I'll just sit there and like skim through the books because I can. And because of that, and the fact that I've DM'd a lot of games, I have a difficult time not backseat DMing. Whenever someone's making a call, I'm like, well, actually, no, be quiet, Brandon, quiet.
I've had to tell you a couple of times. So like, I'm like texting you like, stop metagaming at the table, or like.
I don't do it intentionally. It's hard when you have all the knowledge. Like, he'll describe a monster and I'll know exactly what it is from its description and I'll know its stats. And I'm like, wait, no, can I like blank that out for now?
Well, that kind of brings up an interesting point when referring to Fate Accelerated, just to kind of tie it back in a little bit, that I feel like there's
no monster stat blocks.
Yeah, there's not almost any metagaming at all, because
you can't.
You create it from the table
exactly.
and go from there. It's not a thing where, the player can go buy the same source book and read about it if they really wanted to, or go online to look stuff up for free. It's, you built the sandbox from scratch at the table. It doesn't,
it's like, aha, I know that these sky sharks have low clever, so I'll attack that. It's like, no, that's not how it works.
No.
Yeah, you don't know anything. It's all from the GM's mind, and maybe even just a little bit of your own if you end up having input within the game, but it's all on the spot, and that's what I love even more about these narrative games. And most of them, I mean, I think pretty much every game that's on my shelf works that way, where there is nothing, there's usually examples of like setting up, monsters or encounters or people and things like that, but it's not like, oh, you have to do it this way, or here's ones that you should use within your games. It's just examples for how to set it up, and then you can go buck wild from there and just do whatever you want.
Mm-hmm. And kind of what you mentioned earlier too, the fact that it's such a good system to kind of get started in exploring different TTRPGs outside of your initial system that you started with, whether it was in Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder or Call of Cthulhu or something similar. Fate Accelerated is a great way to start branching out because it's so simple. It's literally 44 pages of a booklet and some dice, both of which you can buy for maybe $15 tops or so on Amazon, and you're ready to go. So it's not only a simple system that's easy to understand, a quick system to get introduced to other systems with, but it's also great for if you're on the budget, and want
Absolutely.
to either you want to explore or you want more options or anything like that. So, because I remember I had gotten the PDF of Fate Accelerated, and I kind of started printing out some of the chapters because I like to highlight and do that kind of way. I'm a hardcover physical book kind of guy, and as I was trying to like get my phone to print, and my wife came over and she's like, "Why don't you just buy it on Amazon? It's like $5." I was like, "Yeah, that probably is cheaper than printing out half of it."
See,
You have a good
electronic
point.
guy. I'm all about the PDFs.
So I got another book for myself, which made me happy too. So
Yeah, and honestly it is extremely accessible because the PDF, I don't even know how if the PDF costs anything. I don't remember if it does.
PDF free.
It's free. It's free in itself. It's 44 pages. You don't even need proper fudge dice. You can just modify, or not modify, but 1 to 2 is negative, 3 to 4 is blank, 5 to 6 is plus, and you can just roll normal 6-sided dice, which most people have. It's extremely accessible, and all of the character sheet stuff and all of that is also available on like Evil Hat's website and super easy to just get a hold of. So extremely accessible, and the physical book just $5. I mean, why not? Why not try it out, or at least to look through it? Because, like we were talking about before, just being able to look through, even if it's just flipping through the book, looking at different pages and different mechanics or ways that they explain it within the game, I think already increases your knowledge with TTRPGs in general. And you can take that and implement it into your own games that you are more comfortable playing. So let's say you only play Fate Accelerated once, but there's aspects of it that you really like. You can incorporate that into other games that you play, no problem, because it just brings you, you get to see a new perspective on things, and it's super, super valuable. And $5 is not bad at all.
no, not at all. So, but yeah, that's kind of mostly the Fate Accelerated system. Is there anything else you wanted to know about it, or?
If you guys actually want to share maybe a encounter, like you were talking about that one very social kind of non-combative encounter at all, if you want to share a bit of the story behind that, I would love to hear it.
I will preface this with spoilers because this encounter was done on our podcast. So
Absolutely.
if anybody wants to go give us a listen on our podcast for our one-shot Fate Accelerated system, spoiler alert, this is the climax of the whole thing.
And yes, please listen if you want to actually hear it all and hear the setup and actually playing through the game. Go listen to Nat One Nerds. They're on Spotify, all of that. Listen to that first. Come back to this.
Yeah, no, we definitely appreciate that because we like to go into detail and then show an example of the system. So
Exactly.
But in this encounter that we had, the premise of the one-shot adventure was that our characters became the new ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future. And so we met in the afterlife, essentially. And an angel named, what was it, Clarice? I can't remember.
I remember we got her name wrong like every time, and she always corrected us.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think Clarice was right.
yeah, it's like Clarice, or it wasn't Clarence. It was
I think Clarice sounds correct.
Yeah, we're really close to that. But it was an angel guide that kind of was our orientation officer, if you will, to our new roles as the coach. They're like, "Oh, you guys live decent enough lives. We think you'd be a good fit to try this out." And we're like, "What's going on? We just died apparently." Like, and So we go to perform our duties, and Brandon's character is the first one. He played the ghost of Christmas Past, so he went to go haunt somebody, but found them like murdered. And
Ooh.
he's like, I can't haunt them if they're already dead. And so that's spun into kind of this murder mystery, where at the end we then encounter and confront the former ghosts of Christmas Past, Present, and Future.
And
Oh
basically,
shit.
these ghosts were they felt a little jaded because they felt like in all their centuries of doing this job, they had never really gotten to help anyone because people suck. So they just came to the general conclusion that this job is pointless, so they quit. And they ended up trying to sabotage our job because they didn't think it should be done anymore. And so we ended up having to confront them, and they ended up giving into their kind of frustration and rage and amalgamating into this kind of oogie boogie type monster. And so we had to fight them. And for example, some of the strategies we used was while we were in the spirit world during our orientation, my character, as an accountant, asked for the book on the souls that had been haunted in the past so I could look through it and kind of see like how did things work out, how the things
Absolutely.
did. And with my stunt that I talked about with Cook the Books, as part of our encounter against them, I created an advantage by quickly fudging some of the numbers and making it look like they had done a lot more good than they actually had. Because unfortunately, they were kind of right. They hadn't done much. But I convinced them that they did. And that kind of started to cause some discord between the former ghosts and made it hard for them to keep their form.
Yeah. And my
Oh, that's so
character,
cool.
yeah, and essentially my character, back to when I mentioned that my character was kind of found his niche, if you will, in using his action to create advantage for the whole party as a whole. And I built off of him cooking the books essentially, and then presenting the argument that, hey, you did, number one, you did more good than you thought you did, thanks to my accountant friend here. And the other aspect was that I brought up was even even if there's only so many people, there were people that did actually change for the better in the long run. There were people that
Absolutely.
essentially, quote unquote, made it to heaven because of what you guys did, even if most of them, reverted back to their old ways. Like that still made a difference for those people.
Mhm.
And the story essentially concluded with that they were going to have a mandatory of 100 years per set of ghosts. That way, this wouldn't happen again. So
Basically, they would let us retire after a while so that way we didn't get all worn out. And after we created those advantages and started kind of sowing that discord between the former ghosts, our companion, who is the mailman, he kind of snuck in and started pulling at the threads that were holding them together, and they ended up just falling apart.
literally and
Oh,
figuratively.
that's so cool. I love that so much.
Let's just say it caused a lot of stress for them.
Yeah.
Oh my god. That is honestly, even just the concept in general, that is so freaking cool. And I love that it ended up just coming, like the conclusion was just workers' rights and mandatory breaks.
Yeah, we didn't see it coming to that sort of conclusion. And of course, we had our moments where our characters did stuff, and the GM was really flexible, in part really thanks to the system itself, and allowing us to throw in a few narrative tidbits to help continue the story. So,
Absolutely. And I think Fate works fantastic for, I mean, high improv games because it is so little planning. I don't think you can really come at the game with a plan. I shouldn't say that, but I like you can have basic like elements set up, but you can't plan everything out because naturally people aren't going to follow the plans. Those are always the memes within D&D. You know, the party's not following the quest or getting sidetracked or anything because I think a lot of people have the expectations that they need to follow the specific story beats. So when you start getting into those improv games, they actually encourage you not to plan as much and to go with the flow and have fun with it and let the players actually contribute to the story and bring aspects in. So
I mean,
cool.
and that is one caution I will give about Fate and Fate Accelerated is because it is so improv heavy. There are some people that aren't that into improv. Maybe they're a little more shy, they're not as creative or good on the spot. And for
Yep.
people like that, the system might be a little more difficult. So again, there's different systems for different people, but just keep in mind that Fate is amazing. We've talked so good about it, but it may not be for everyone if you don't like improv that much.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
it's definitely a very improv heavy system for sure. Which is probably why that other podcast is called Improv Tabletop, because they use Fate Accelerated and they were improving at the tabletop. But with Fate Accelerated, it's kind of nice because when we were talking about those jokes where D&D parties don't follow the narrative, if you do Fate Accelerated right and the table's on board and you're all collaborating, there's no way you can't not steer away from the narrative because you're building it together as you go. So I think that's
Absolutely.
what's kind of nice is that there's not really. I feel like in Fate Accelerated, it's much harder to railroad.
Yeah,
which is really kind of nice because now there are players like in D&D. I feel like there are players kind of like myself where especially if you trust your DM or you're confident in your DM or you like where things are going, you kind of want to see where it goes and you're willing to follow the tracks if you want to. But with Fate Accelerated, all those kinds of, or those players that like to just do whatever they want or min-max or whatever, but with Fate Accelerated, all those players can come together. And once they're in the story, they can be in the story together. And there's not any major difference mechanically from one character to another, and allows everybody to have an equal opportunity as much as they want to contribute to the adventure.
Yeah, you don't have that one power gamer in the party just smashing everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess that is a good point, though. If you really like to power game or min-max, that's where you're comfortable. If you like to just, fight monsters and do attacks, Fate's probably not going to be the game for you. And that's okay. It still might be an interesting experience to try it if you want. I think it's always worth trying different games to at least, see what they're about. I think that's the best way to find your play style as a player and as a group, especially as a GM, is just trying different games and being able to experience them. And if you find that you end up drifting more towards the way of power gaming and min-maxing, which there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but if you go that way, Fate's not going to be the game for you because it's not going to provide that.
Mm-mm.
The only thing you can power game in Fate is your improv skills.
Yep.
Yeah, if you want to power game your improv, go to Fate.
That is one thing that could happen, is you could have one player who's just fantastic at improv and they could just dance circles around the other players, which I guess would be the equivalent of power gaming here. But that's more of just actual player interactions with each other than the actual games issue.
Yeah, and sharing the spotlight, and that's then goes to the GM with making sure everyone gets their moments.
Exactly.
Yep. There's no mechanics that are encouraging that.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's like if everybody picks Paladin and then I pick Bard. I'm gonna stick out like a sore thumb. Yeah, not always in a great way. So.
Apparently, you didn't want to smite.
No,
but yeah.
Wanted to sing.
I wanted to sing. I just want to be a dancer.
I'll take a bard.
I mean, but the great thing in Fate itself is you could technically play a bard-like player that is a more supportive character. You'll just end up taking the setup action more often, and
you'd be devoted to giving your fellow players advantage or like creating disadvantages for the enemies.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that I think gives a lot of opportunity for people to be able to play enough different play styles within this game.
Yeah, because that's what my character did, and that's mostly what Brandon's character did too. It just kind of was funny that the 60-something-year-old mailman was the one actually doing the physical.
He's been lugging packages around his whole life. He's got the bulk for it.
Well, he ended up
strong.
being the mailman ended up being the ghost of Christmas Future, and so he got the scythe.
Yeah,
he got the actual weapon.
That is so funny. That is so freaking funny. But I mean, it just goes to show you can even go into the game with a certain plan, and then you play your character, and you end up playing a different way as well. I think to play Fate, you should be open to the ideas and the changes that could just happen within the game, even if you're just playing a one shot. You might go in being like, I'm gonna attack things, and then end up just supporting and creating advantages for your other party members.
Yeah.
Which is just as valid of an action as any of the other ones. Because the way that
Yes,
Fate
which
has
I
them
love.
set up and explained, honestly, in the long run, they're all just as equally, noted. They're all as equally valuable in the long run. So
Absolutely.
that's why I was very happy doing mostly advantage, or granting advantage based actions in the game. So while the mailman chose attack.
And we were talking a little earlier about, if with it being an improv game, it can be more uncomfortable as someone who might not be super used to improv or RP. But I think, again, like I said, it's a good challenge to at least try. Because maybe the way that Fate sets itself up, Fate Accelerated specifically sets itself up, might actually help you get a grasp on roleplay. I'm a person who actually, when I first started to play D&D, that was an aspect that was completely lost to me. I struggled with roleplay so hard, and it wasn't until I took a long break and was able to play a character again and then really started to DM that I got more comfortable with it. And part of that was just building up the confidence. That was, at least for me, what I needed to work on. Maybe for you, it might just need the structure of social aspects of your character. Have that structure there to make you feel more comfortable using it. Maybe it's just confidence, and maybe you just need to play a game and see how it feels. And there's nothing wrong with playing a narrative game if you are a bit more shy or uncomfortable with RP, because it could help you get better if that's a challenge that you would like to give yourself.
Oh yeah, like I mentioned earlier that I'm a psychology major. I actually, as one of my projects, I ended up helping to conduct a study on the effects of tabletop role-playing games with people with social anxieties and social phobias. And it was really
Mhm.
cool seeing how effective it is at helping people come out of their bubble.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so social. I mean, the whole thing is collaborative storytelling. You are working with a group of people. Even if you are even if you have the social anxieties and are more uncomfortable in those situations, it will help you slowly come out of your shell a bit, because that's a big aspect of the game. It's so cool.
Oh yeah. And that's really nice about as one reads through the booklet for Fate Accelerated, it's a very short booklet, but it still has a lot of really awesome information and a lot of hints and things that you can try doing to improve your improv skills. Outside of the mechanics, which already encourage that within themselves.
Absolutely. And I think if you're wanting to try Fate Accelerated, I mean, keep in mind, it's not about what your character can do. It's about who they are, and just embody that aspect of the game and go to town.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So.
If there is anything else you would like to, if there's anything you would like to mention for Fate Accelerated or add on to what we've said before, please do.
I mean, I feel like we've covered it pretty in depth. Got a good discussion about who it's for, who would like it, what it's about. Overall, it's a great system. We both like it, and it's definitely one that's super easy and accessible for anyone to try. It's not as daunting as a lot of the other big ones.
I carry it around with a
Absolutely.
backpack when I go out of the house, just in case, there's a opportunity to do some improv tabletopping somewhere. So
I'm going out to a restaurant. I gotta make sure to bring my Fate Accelerated.
I mean, I could if I really wanted to.
You never know what could happen. You don't know. There might be an impromptu tabletop RPG like session that happens, and you need to be prepared. You need to have your dice handy, you need to have your book handy, and you are ready to go.
Maybe the restaurant's extra busy and there's an hour wait time for food. Just down play a quick game.
I've actually
Exactly.
I've actually heard a story actually today where somebody was explaining that as a kid they got into TTRPGs because of hour-long bus rides to and from school because they lived out in like the county rural area,
Oh
and
shoot.
they ended up doing adventures on the bus for like
That's so cool.
yeah. So I mean, I kind of jokingly say that I carry it around, but I'm also serious when I say that I carry it around because, if I go over to have dinner with my parents or the in-laws or whatever, or with some friends who might be interested and they want to do something after dinner, I have something that's even better than a board game. It's a TTRPG. So, and it's really easy. It's a very simple sheet. It takes like 15 minutes to explain and you can kind of jump in. So,
Absolutely. It's a fantastic one-shot system. It really is.
yeah, we definitely encourage people to give it a real shot, if you will. Yeah, okay, somebody got the dad joke. But yeah, give it a real shot and really go for it. It's a fun system. We definitely encourage people. We gave it a good grade on our podcast. We definitely plan on our podcast returning to the
Fate Core.
Yeah, actually go to Fate Core and actually kind of dive even deeper down the rabbit hole, and we're excited to do that sooner than later.
Absolutely. So excited for that because Fate Core is definitely one that I'm still very curious about. Since it is a bigger book, I haven't had a chance to fully read through it or anything, but it is so open. And I think a lot of the advice within the game is, how to improv, how to play the game, all of that, get people comfortable with it, which is always really fun. But yeah, if you really want to play an awesome one-shot, like a really great one-shot game that's super easy to pick up, especially with new groups, and you just want to try something new, especially if you're on a budget, try Fate Accelerated. Have a great time. The PDF is free. The actual book is $5. And you can either use, normal dice, or you could even, if you use Roll20, there's fudge dice within that. They're super accessible. You can have a great time, pick it up really easy. So go right ahead and do it. And I want to just say thank you again for Nat One Nerds for coming onto my podcast and talking about it, because this was super great. I'm so happy to have learned more about it, because again, it's a very interesting system and I was very curious about it in general. So thank you so much.
No, thank you. We've had a great time being on your podcast.
Yeah,
It's been a lot. I had a great time being on yours.
It's fun collaborating with other people, getting to talking with you off the podcast about dice, all sorts of stuff.
all of the things getting touched on,
Yeah.
great. all the TTRPGs, dice, actual books, the games, all of that, got it covered. One day I will make fudge dice though. One day. It's just I don't know what, the licensing around that is. I'll figure that out. But absolutely.
If you ever make fudge dice, I will buy dice.
Boo! But yes, thank you for coming on, and I hope you guys had a great time listening, and yeah, that's the end of the episode. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the RPG Goblin. I really hope that you enjoyed it. If you would like to support the podcast, I would really appreciate if you followed and rated the RPG Goblin on your favorite podcast platform. That would really mean the world to me, and I would appreciate it so much. Thank you again to Parker and Brandon for coming on to the RPG Goblin and talking about Fate Accelerated with me. It was super, super fun, and I can't wait to have you on again. And if you haven't checked out their podcast yet, their name is... If you haven't checked out their podcast just yet, their podcast is called Nat One Nerds. And it is also a TTRPG podcast where they explore different systems. They go a little bit more in depth and actually play through and discuss the system afterwards and all of that. So I 100% recommend them, and their name will be, their social media and the name of their podcast will be in the description of this episode. So the next episode of the RPG Goblin will be coming out Friday, March 30th, and it will be about Fate Core, which is essentially the expanded version of Fate. It's goes way more into detail, and I actually bring on Curtis for this one, and it was such a great conversation. If you're really into Fate after this episode and you really want to delve in deeper, I 100% recommend listening to the next episode. I guess I'll see you next week. Thanks for listening.